The first time the new governess heard her own true name spoken aloud, she had been at Stannock Abbey for 2 days, and she did not yet know what to do with it. It was the second morning of her employment. 8-year-old Elspeth Marchwood, who had the unimpressed gravity of a child raised by serious adults, looked up from her primer, set down her pencil with the deliberation of a magistrate, and said, "You are not called Anne." The new governess, known to the household, to the agency in London, and to the steward of Stannock Abbey as Miss Anwen Caradog, lately of Aberystwyth, set down her teacup with the perfect composure of a young woman who had spent 22 years being told she was someone she was not. "And what," she asked, "makes you think so?" Elspeth's brother Florian, 3 minutes her younger and identical in his solemn dark coloring, did not look up from his copybook. He was making a careful Latin translation of a sentence about a hunting dog. He had heard the exchange, and he was keeping his thoughts to himself, which was his way. "Because," Elspeth said, "my mother used to say your real name in her sleep before she died. She said it so often, I learnt it. She said it the night she died." The schoolroom was very quiet. A coal cracked in the grate. Beyond the leaded panes, the November rain was beginning to fall against Stannock Abbey, and the wind across the Yorkshire moor was the wind of a country in which storms were a season, not an event. "What name?" asked the new governess, who had a fine, clear voice and used it carefully. "Iolanthe," said Elspeth. The new governess did not move. She did not blink. The training of 22 years of watchful living held the muscles of her face as still as a portrait. But under the bodice of her plain gray dress, her heart had begun to beat in a way she had not felt before, and her hands, hidden in the folds of her sleeves, had gone perfectly cold. She had never spoken the name Iolanthe aloud. She had never written it. She had never, to the best of her knowledge, heard another living soul say it. But she had read it once, in her late aunt's hand, on the back of a small enamel locket she had found wrapped in linen at the bottom of her aunt's sewing box, 3 weeks after the funeral. She had not understood then why the name was there. She had not understood why her aunt, that good, watchful, frightened, patient woman who had raised her, had hidden such a thing. She understood now. She inclined her head to her 2 pupils. She said, "What an unusual name. We shall return to your translation, Master Florian, in just a moment. Miss Elspeth, you may continue with your sums." She rose, set the teacup gently on the tray, walked to the window, and looked out across the moor at the great gray dome of weather rolling in from the west. She breathed once, very slowly, and counted the rooks on the ash tree by the gate. There were 7. She had been taught to count things by an aunt who had known how the human heart could come apart when there was nothing else for the hands to do. She had also been taught by the same aunt that she must never trust a kindness she had not earned, and never enter a great house without first finding its second door, and never, under any circumstance, no matter who asked her, no matter how gently speak the name Iolanthe, even to herself, until the packet in her trunk was opened. The packet was still in her trunk. It had been sealed with red wax for 3 months, and it bore in her aunt's hand the instruction, "Open this only when you can no longer endure not to." She had endured for 3 months. She thought, looking at the rain on the moor, that she might not endure another 3 days. She had come to Stannock Abbey through the ordinary channels. Mrs. Pellew's agency of Bedford Square in London dealt only with the better houses and required references. Anwen had 3. She had received the offer by letter, £60 a year, and her keep, and she had accepted it because she could not bear the cottage in Aberystwyth without her aunt, and because the wages would let her live without selling the cottage at all. She had come north on the mail from Birmingham, in a fog so thick the coachman had walked the last 6 miles, leading the horses by the bridle, and she had arrived at Stannock at dusk in a downpour, and the housekeeper, Mrs. Hartshorn, a woman with the face of a sensible apostle, had taken one look at her wet boots and said, "Get those off, child. There is a fire in the small parlor. His Grace will see you when he is ready." His Grace had seen her at 9:30 that night. Theron Marchwood, 6th Duke of Stannock, was 32 years of age, very tall, dark-haired, with the first early streak of gray at the left temple, and the first thing Anwen had noticed about him was that he had the eyes of a man who had not slept properly for a year and a half. The second was that he did not waste words. He had asked her 4 questions about her education, her Latin, her opinion of corporal punishment, and her view of the proper hour for a child's bedtime, and he had listened to her answers with the close, exhausted attention of a man who had been disappointed 3 times already and had no intention of being disappointed a 4th. At the end he had said, "Mrs. Pellew has not lied to me. You may begin in the morning. The children breakfast at 8. You will take it with them. Good night, Miss Caradog." He had not smiled. He had not stood when she rose. That had been the night before yesterday. This morning his daughter had spoken her true name in the schoolroom, and the Duke of Stannock did not, so far as Anwen could tell, know that his own household had just shifted on its foundation. She did not, that day, ask Elspeth any further question about the name. She finished the morning's lessons. She corrected Florian's Latin. She walked the children round the wet garden in their cloaks at 11:30. She read to them from a book of fairy tales for half an hour after luncheon, and when Elspeth, sitting on the rug at her feet, said quietly, "Are you cross with me?" the new governess set down the book and said, "No, my dear, I am thinking. There is a difference. I shall explain it to you when you are older, and perhaps not even then." That night, after the children were abed, she went to her own small room at the end of the east passage, and she locked the door, and she took her trunk out from under the bed, and she opened it, and she took out the packet sealed with the lily within a thorn. She looked at it for a long time. She did not open it. Not yet, she thought. Not until I know what house I have walked into. She put the packet back. She locked the trunk. She took the small enamel locket from the inner pocket of her traveling case, where she had carried it since the funeral, and she opened it, and she read again the engraving on the inside of the lid that she had not been able to make sense of for 3 months. To Iolanthe, from her mother, who never had the time. May 1834, 2 months before the coup in Vendaria, which Anwen had read about, briefly, in an old newspaper her aunt had kept folded in a Bible. The coup at Vendaria. The royal family killed. The infant princess never recovered. The principality absorbed by its larger neighbor within the year, and forgotten, as small principalities were forgotten by all but the people who had lived in them. Anwen Caradog had been born in May of 1832. So her aunt had told her. So her papers said. She closed the locket. She put it back in the case. She lay down in her narrow bed at Stannock Abbey, and she did not sleep, and she listened all night to the house breathing around her. In the days that followed, she did 3 things, quietly, each at its own time. She found the late Duchess's portrait hanging at the head of the great staircase, and she stood before it one wet afternoon and studied the face of the woman the children had so loved. Lady Helena Marchwood, née Beaumont, painted at 27, 2 years before her death. A long, intelligent face, brown hair simply dressed, dark eyes looking out of the canvas with the steady, considering regard of a woman who had been listening carefully when the painter spoke and had decided he was a fool. Lady Helena had died, the housekeeper had said, of a long fever. 18 months ago, this May. The fever had taken her in 9 days. She had spent the last 3 years of her life in what her husband called her European correspondence, and her maid called her papers. The second thing Anwen did was visit the library. The library at Stannock was a very fine one, 2 stories high, with a gallery and 7,000 volumes catalogued by the late Duchess herself. Anwen, alone at 4:30 on a Thursday afternoon, while the children napped, found the section devoted to European history. She found the volumes on the lesser sovereignties of Central Europe, and she found, between Volume 4 and Volume 6, that Volume 6 was missing. There was, however, a slip of paper tucked into Volume 4 at the place where the chapter on Vendaria began. The slip of paper was a list, in a fine, slanted, woman's hand, of 7 names. 6 had been crossed through with a single line. The seventh had not. The seventh name was Iolanthe Vesper. Beneath it, in the same hand, a date, May 1834. Beneath that, 3 words, find her, quickly. Unwin replaced the slip. She closed the book. She returned to the schoolroom, and she taught Elspeth the difference between a peninsula and an isthmus, and she did not, that evening, sleep at all. The third thing she did, on the Saturday of her first week, was open the packet. She did it at midnight, in her own room, with the door locked and the curtain drawn and a single candle. The packet contained 3 things. The first was a letter from her aunt, written 9 months before her death, in a hand that was already beginning to weaken. My dear, it began, if you are reading this, I am dead, and you have been able to bear my absence long enough to wish to know why I lived. I have hesitated 30 times to write this letter, and I am writing it tonight because the doctor has said 1 year at most, and I will not leave you to find this out from a stranger. Your name is Iolanthe Aurelie Vesper. You were born in the city of Helbrunn, in the Principality of Vendaria, on the 22nd of May, in the year 1832. Your father was Aldrich Vesper, the last sovereign prince of that small country. Your mother was Mira Vesper, his wife, my elder sister, the kindest woman who ever wore a crown and the bravest, and the world is a smaller place for losing her. I am not your aunt by adoption, my darling. I am your aunt by blood. I was Princess Rosine of Vendaria before I was Mrs. Caradog of Aberystwyth, and the man you knew as your Uncle Owain was a tutor to my father's court before he was a Welsh schoolmaster, and we married for love in a chapel at the foot of the Vesper Mountains in the spring of 1830, and we left Vendaria for the wedding journey, and we did not, by the grace of a slow ship and a bad road, return. The coup came in July of 1834. Your mother and father were killed by men who had been paid, in part, by an English ducal family, whose name I will write here once and never again, Marchwood, of Stannock, in the county of Yorkshire. The 4th Duke, Edmund Marchwood, sent gold and rifles to the men who killed your parents in exchange for trading rights along the Vesper River that his family enjoys to this day. He is dead these 12 years. His grandson holds the title now. I do not know what manner of man the grandson is. I have prayed all my life that you and he would never meet. Unwin closed her eyes. She opened them. She read on. Hen, you were carried out of Helbrunn in a fish basket by your mother's lady-in-waiting, who walked 70 miles on foot through the mountains to bring you to me at the Austrian border. She died of pneumonia 3 weeks later. You were 2 years old. You called me Mama within a week, and I have answered to it ever since, and I do not regret it, and I would do it again, and I am sorry I did not tell you in life. The men who killed your parents have been searching for you for 20 years. They will not stop. The English duke who paid them is dead, but the men he kept on payroll for that purpose are not all dead, and at least one of them, a London solicitor by the name of Almeric Drage, came to our own door this past April, posing as a relation, in search of his half-sister's lost child, and I sent him away convinced you had died as a child of 7 and lay buried at St. Padarn's churchyard in 1838. He believed it. I have prayed every night since that he continues to believe it. I have left you the cottage. I have left you £60 in the Aberystwyth Bank. I have left you the locket your mother had made for you in the month before her death. I have left you, also, this last instruction, and you may obey it, or not, as you see fit, for you are no child now, and I have no right to command you. Do not seek your inheritance. There is nothing left in Vendaria to inherit. The country has been swallowed. The crown is gone. The river your father ruled is now a German trade route. There is no court to receive you, no people to lead, and no good in the world that comes of a young woman walking into a place where her name is a death sentence. Live, my Iolanthe. Live as Unwin Caradog of Aberystwyth, and forgive me, in time, for the silence in which I raised you, because it was the only roof I had to put over your head. The lady-in-waiting's name was Liesel Brenner. Pray for her sometimes. She earned it. All the love I have ever had. Your Mama Rosine. The second thing in the packet was a small bundle of papers in her aunt's hand. Notes, dates, names of men who had served the Vesper court, names of men who had betrayed it. The third was a single calling card, edged in black, bearing the name Mr. Almeric Drage of Lincoln's Inn, London, and her aunt's note pinned to the back. This is the man I described in the letter. If you ever see this card produced in any house in which you serve, leave that house at once, by any means. Anwen read the calling card twice. Then she folded everything back into the packet, put the packet inside the bodice of her dress, against her skin, and went very quietly down to the library, where the Duke of Stannick kept a great cabinet of household business by the fire, and she opened the small drawer where the housekeeper had told her, on the morning of her arrival, the day's calling cards were placed for the master. There were 3 cards in the drawer. The topmost was edged in black and bore the name Mr. Almeric Drage of Lincoln's Inn, London, and on the back, in pencil, a fresh note in the housekeeper's hand. Arriving Tuesday next. Bedchamber prepared. It was Sunday. She had 2 days. She did not run. She had considered it in the dark hours between Sunday's discovery and Monday's dawn, and rejected it. Liesel Brenner had walked 70 miles through the mountains to put her in a fish basket on an Austrian road, and Rosine Caradog had spent 20 years answering to Mama for a child not her own, and Lady Helena Marchwood had she now suspected done something that had cost her her life. 3 women had given her what she had. She would not, on the 3rd day of the news, run from a 4th. She would, however, ask the Duke a question. She asked it on Monday morning at breakfast, while the twins were eating their porridge. "Your Grace," she said, "may I speak with you in the library before luncheon?" The Duke of Stannick looked up from his coffee. He had been reading a letter. He folded it slowly, set it down, and looked at her with the weary, steady regard with which he had hired her. "Is anything amiss with the children?" "No, Your Grace. The children are very well. It is a private matter." He looked at her another moment. Whatever he saw in her face evidently decided him. 11:30, he said. "The library." 1. She came at 11:30. He was already there, by the fire, his back to the door. He was holding a small key in his hand, and he was looking at it the way a man looks at a thing he has dreaded picking up. She closed the door behind her. "Miss Caradog," he said without turning, "I shall not pretend to be a quicker man than I am. My daughter told me on Friday evening, in the manner of a child mentioning the color of a cat, that her mother used to speak a name in her sleep, and that the name was Iolanthe, and that the new governess had gone perfectly white when she heard it." Anwen did not move. "I have sat with that information," the Duke said, "for 2 days. I have not slept either of those nights. Last night, at 3 in the morning, I went to my late wife's writing desk, which has been locked since the day she died, and I opened it with this key, which she gave me a week before her death, and asked me to use only when I was ready, and which I have not, in 18 months, been ready to use. I am ready now." He turned. He held a thick packet of papers in his other hand. "My wife," he said, "spent the last 3 years of her life investigating my grandfather. She left me a letter. She left me a sealed report. She left me, at the bottom of the packet, a list of 7 names. 6 are crossed through. The 7th is not. The 7th is yours. Anwen Caradog, Princess Iolanthe Aureli, Vesper of Vindaria, 22 years old, 3 months an orphan, one Sunday into the worst week of her life, looked at the Duke of Stannick across the carpet of his library, and she said, in the voice her aunt had taught her to use when there was nothing else in the world but the truth, "Your Grace, I think your wife was murdered. I think the man who is arriving here tomorrow killed her. And I think she gave you that key because she knew he would, and she knew it would not be safe for you to know any of this until he was already on his way." The Duke did not move. Then he said, very quietly, "Yes, I think so too." They sat by the fire for 2 hours. They did not ring for tea. They went through both packets together, her aunt's and his wife's, and they laid the papers out on the long oak table in 2 columns, and they read. Lady Helena Marchwood had begun her work in the spring of 1850, when she had found, while sorting her late father-in-law's papers, a bound ledger marked Vendarian account. The ledger had recorded 11 years of payments, small, regular, anonymous, to a series of accounts in Frankfurt and Vienna, and one larger payment, made on the 18th of June, 1834, to a man named Conrad Streck, who was identifiable only because the late 4th Duke had written, in pencil, in the margin of the ledger, Streck for Vendaria. 5 weeks later, the royal family of Vendaria had been killed in their own palace, and Conrad Streck had become the foreign minister of the new government of Vendaria. And the Marchwood family's interest in the timber concessions of the Vesper River, held in name by a Hamburg trading company, had become very considerable indeed. Lady Helena had retained a private inquiry agent in Vienna in 1851 and a second agent in 1852. She had learned from these two men what the late 4th Duke had paid Streck for and what the price had included, and that an infant child of the murdered prince had been smuggled out of the city by her mother's lady-in-waiting, and was, by the agent's best information, still alive somewhere in Britain. She had spent the better part of 2 years looking. She had found her, in March of 1853, in a cottage in Aberystwyth, in the company of a woman named Roisin Caradog, who was, by the records of the parish at Helbrunn, the murdered queen's younger sister. Lady Helena had not approached. She had instead written to Mrs. Pellew of Bedford Square, with whom she had a long correspondence, and had instructed her by a letter Unwin now held in her hand to engage Unwin Caradog on a generous salary as governess to the Marchwood twins on the first occasion that the present governess could be honorably dismissed. Lady Helena had died in May of 1853, 2 months after finding Iolanthe. Mrs. Pellew had waited 15 months until Anwen herself was in need of a position before writing with the offer. Lady Helena's last letter, addressed to her husband, was the one paper Unwin did not read. The Duke read it alone, by the window, with his back to her. When he was finished, he folded it. He stood for a moment, looking out at the rain. Then he walked back to the table, set the letter down, and said, in the flat voice of a man who has just learnt the worst thing he is ever going to learn. She knew Drage was coming for her. She refused to leave the children. She gave me the key in the 3rd week of her illness. The fever was real. He brought it. There is, God forgive him, a man in Vienna who specializes in such things. And Drage had him send a vial. She wrote it all down. She wanted me to know, but not to act until you were under this roof. She said. He stopped. He did not go on with what she had said. Unwin rose. She crossed the room. She did not, in any sense she had been raised to know, have the right to do what she did, but she did it anyway. She put her hand, very briefly, on the Duke of Stanhope's hand where it lay on the table, and she let it rest there for the count of 3 breaths, and then she withdrew it. He did not move. He arrives tomorrow at 3, she said. Yes. Then we have until 3 tomorrow, she said, to decide what kind of man and woman we mean to be. Mr. Almeric Drage arrived at Stanhope Abbey at 12 minutes past 3 the following afternoon, in a hired carriage from Whitby Station, in a black coat and a black hat and a pair of grey gloves. The housekeeper showed him into the small drawing-room and brought him tea, which he did not drink. The Duke received him at 3:30 in the library, which had been arranged for the purpose. The papers had been put away. The fire was high. There were 2 chairs by the hearth, and a third by the table, and at the table sat Miss Unwin Caradog, in the same plain grey dress she had worn at her interview, with her hands folded in her lap and her face composed. Mr. Drage stopped in the doorway. Then he smiled. It was a small, thin, perfectly courteous smile, and it did not extend to his eyes. And Unwin, who had been raised by a woman who knew how to read a room, saw in that smile 20 years of patience finally arriving where it had been going. He had seen her aunt's features in her face. He had seen her mother's features in her face. He had spent 20 years looking for a child he had been told was buried in Wales, and he had found, instead of a grave, a young woman in a grey dress, sitting at a Yorkshire table, and he was not, in that moment, in any hurry at all. "Your Grace," Drage said. I had not understood you had a guest at our meeting. Miss Caradog is the children's governess, said the Duke. She has my full confidence. Sit down, Drage. There is a matter we must address. Drage sat down. The Duke did not. He stood by the fire, with his hand resting on the mantel, and he said, in the level voice of a man who had spent the last 4 hours rehearsing how not to shake. My wife left me a letter. I read it on Sunday night. I read it again last night. I have read it 3 times in total, and I am quite clear, Mr. Drage, on its contents. You will, before you leave this house, write a full confession of your role in her death and in the deaths of the Vesper family in 1834, and you will sign it before 2 witnesses, and I will deliver it personally tomorrow morning to the magistrate at York. You will not leave this house tonight. Drage's face did not change. Your Grace is unwell, he said softly. Your wife was a clever woman, but her last illness was caused, said the Duke, by a vial procured by a man in Vienna whose name and direction my wife knew, and recorded, and gave to me. I have already begun to write to him. I have already begun to write. Also to 2 other men who were in your employ in 1834, both of whom are now in Liverpool, both of whom will, when offered the choice between speaking and the rope, prefer the former. Drage's hand moved, very slightly, towards the inside of his coat. It was a small movement. Unwin saw it. So did the Duke. The Duke had been a soldier. He had been, before his elder brother's death, had made him heir at 23, a captain in the Coldstream Guards, and he was 32 years old, and he had not slept properly for 2 nights. But he was, in that moment, faster than the older man. He crossed the 4 feet between them in a stride and a half. He had Drage's wrist in his hand before the pistol cleared the coat, and he had the pistol on the table a moment later, and the 3rd man in the room, the Duke's steward, Mr. Calder, who had been waiting behind the screen at the window for precisely this moment, stepped out, took the pistol, and said, with the calm of a man who had served 3 Dukes of Stanhope, and would serve a 4th if asked, I have him, your Grace. It was over in 9 seconds. Mr. Almeric Drage was bound to the chair by the table with a length of curtain cord. He wrote his confession at the Duke's dictation, in his own hand, with the steward's pistol resting on the table 6 inches from his elbow. He signed it. The steward and the housekeeper signed it as witnesses. The Duke folded it. He put it in his inner pocket. He sent a groom to York. At dawn the next morning, 2 officers of the West Riding Constabulary arrived at Stanhope Abbey, took Mr. Drage into custody, and conveyed him to York Castle, where, 4 months later, after the longest trial in the county that decade, he was hanged for the murder of Lady Helena Marchwood, and for conspiracy in the murders, 2 decades earlier, of Prince Aldrich, Princess Mira, and 3 members of their household, in a city most of England had forgotten the name of. The night Drage was taken to York, the Duke of Stanhope and his children's governess sat by the library fire long after the household had gone to bed. They did not that night speak of marriage. They spoke instead of Vendaria, of the river that ran through it, of the small gray city where she had been born and would never see, and of the lady-in-waiting, Liesel Brenner. They spoke of Lady Helena, who had spent the last 3 years of her life on a debt none of her ancestors had asked her to pay. They spoke of the late 4th Duke of Stanhope, whose ledger sat on the table between them, and of the question of what was owed and to whom. I have no claim on Vendaria, Unwin said. There is nothing left to claim. The country is gone. My aunt was right. Then the claim falls to me, said the Duke. The money my family made from your father's river is in this house. I shall give it back. Not to the German government that swallowed your country, to the people of the Vesper Valley, by name, by household, every silver shilling, and the timber concession with it. I shall need my wife's agents in Vienna. I shall need yours when you have them. I shall need 10 years. You shall have them, she said. He looked at her. And what, he said, shall I have of you? She thought about it. You shall have my friendship, your Grace, for as long as this work takes. You shall have my hand at this table for the writing of any letter you do not wish to write alone. You shall have, if you wish it, My company at the schoolroom breakfast each morning at 8. And when the work is finished, when the last shilling has been paid, and the last name on my aunt's list is dead or pardoned, and your children are grown enough to understand what their mother died for, you may, if you still wish it then, ask me a question. I shall answer it. I shall not, before then, either tell you my answer or refuse to give it. Is that a bargain you can keep? It is, he said. He did not, that night, take her hand. He did not need to. They had work to do. In the spring of 1867, in a small gray city in the Vesper Valley that had once belonged to the Principality of Vendaria, the Queen Mira Vesper Free School opened its doors to its first 60 pupils. The school had been built with the proceeds of the Marchwood timber concession, returned in full with 12 years of accumulated interest, to the 73 families along the Vesper River whose fathers and grandfathers had been displaced by the coup of 1834. The families had voted, in town meetings held over 3 winters, to apply the largest share of the restitution to the founding of a school for the children of the valley, and they had named it, by a vote of 43 to 30, after the murdered queen. It was opened by a tall, dark-haired Englishman of 45, the 6th Duke of Stanhope, in a plain, dark coat, who spoke in carefully memorized German for 7 minutes and presented the schoolmaster with the deeds, and by a small, composed Englishwoman of 34 in a dove-gray traveling dress, who spoke nothing at all, but who walked through the schoolrooms afterwards with the schoolmaster, asked after the children's books and the state of the roof, and, on her way out, paused at the small bronze plaque by the door bearing the Queen's name. She put 2 fingers to it. She did not weep. She had not, since the night she had read her aunt's letter, wept for any part of this. She had decided, that night, that she would not. She looked at the plaque for the length of 3 breaths, and then she turned, and the Duke of Stanhope, her husband of 9 years, the father of her 2 younger children, and the keeper of a promise made by candlelight in a Yorkshire library 12 years before, was waiting with the carriage. They went home by way of Vienna. They were home in Yorkshire by midsummer. Florian Marchwood, the elder twin, was 20 and at Cambridge and reading classics. Elspeth Marchwood, the younger, was 20 and refused to go to Cambridge and was instead managing the home farm with a competence that frightened the steward and pleased her stepmother enormously. The 2 younger children were a boy of 7 called Aldrich, after his mother's father, and a girl of 4 called Helena, after the woman who had set the entire course of their lives in motion before either of them was born. The portrait of Lady Helena Beaumont Marchwood, painted in 1851, still hung at the head of the great staircase. The portrait of Iolanthe Aurelie Vesper Marchwood, painted in 1859, in a quiet gray dress with her hand resting on a book, hung opposite. The 2 women looked at one another across the stair landing in the way of 2 women who would have liked one another very much had they been given the time. Sometimes, on winter evenings, when the wind across the moor was the wind of the country it was, Iolanthe would stop on the landing on her way down to dinner and look up at Helena and say, very quietly, the only word she had ever said aloud to her, and would ever say, "Thank you. This story has now traveled to your corner of the world, and that is the part I never quite get used to. I sit in a small studio with a candle and a microphone, and somewhere out there, on a train, in a kitchen, by a window, in a country I may never see, you are listening. Tell me, in the comments below, what beautiful part of the world you are watching from tonight. A city, a town, a village, even just the country. It thrills me beyond measure to know how far these stories travel from the corner of my studio. If this one moved you, if you held your breath when the child said the name, if you caught your own breath when the Duke crossed the 4 feet to the pistol, if you smiled at the small bronze plaque in the schoolroom doorway, please tap the like button and ring the bell so that the next story finds you wherever you are. Until then, keep your candles lit and your hearts a little brave. Good night.